Narcissists can be far more shaken by your genuine indifference than by simple no contact. To understand why, you have to look at what happens beneath the surface when a narcissistic relationship ends. In the beginning, they may idealize you intensely, creating the impression that you are uniquely important to them and that the relationship has some extraordinary future. They build an emotional story around you, making everything feel powerful and meaningful. But eventually, that idealized image can fade, and their manipulative patterns, dishonesty, and self-centered behavior begin to become visible. Then the breakup arrives, and what follows can feel like stepping out of a violent, emotional storm. The relationship may be over, but the psychological effects can linger long afterward, leaving you questioning what happened and wondering how someone could change so dramatically. If you have experienced the confusion and emotional exhaustion that can come from dealing with narcissistic behavior, you already understand how difficult these relationships can become. The period after separation can be especially intense because narcissists may react strongly to losing access to someone who once provided attention, emotional energy, validation, or a sense of control. Sometimes they initiate the breakup themselves, leaving their partner confused and emotionally unprepared, while other times the partner reaches their breaking point and chooses to walk away first. Ending the relationship can be incredibly difficult, but it can also represent an important act of self-preservation. Whether you were discarded, walked away, blocked, or simply decided that enough was enough, the most important thing afterward is understanding what is happening psychologically, so you do not get pulled back into the same cycle. One of the resources narcissistic relationships can become so confusing is that the narcissist may initially see their partner as someone who can rescue them from their internal struggles. They may unconsciously place enormous expectations on the relationship, imagining that another person can finally make them feel complete, secure, admired, or emotionally stable. But eventually, reality exposes the limits of that fantasy. No partner can repair another person's unresolved wounds, regulate their entire emotional world, or remove every insecurity they carry. You are not responsible for fixing someone else's inner chaos. You are not a magician, therapist, or emotional emergency service. A relationship cannot substitute for genuine personal accountability and meaningful psychological work. Once you understand this, you stop carrying responsibility for problems that were never yours to solve in the first place. This is also where the idea of indifference becomes so important. After a narcissistic relationship ends, one of the most difficult things for them to tolerate may not be your anger, sadness, or even your hatred. It can be the moment when you genuinely stop caring about what they are doing. Anger still represents emotional investment. Arguments still provide engagement. Jealousy still communicates that they matter. But authentic indifference removes the emotional reward altogether. When you stop reacting to their provocations, stop checking their profiles, stop wondering who they are with, and stop trying to prove your worth, the dynamic changes dramatically. They can no longer easily measure their influence through your reactions. The attention and emotional control they once relied upon begin disappearing, and that loss can feel deeply unsettling to someone who is accustomed to having an emotional impact on others. This is why your emotional withdrawal can sometimes affect a narcissist more profoundly than simply blocking them or disappearing without explanation. No contact removes access, but genuine detachment removes the emotional connection they may still be looking for. There is a major difference between staying silent while secretly hoping they return and becoming genuinely invested in your own life again. The first still leaves the narcissist occupying your mind. The second begins to remove them from your internal world completely. When you reach the point where their behavior no longer determines your mood, their presence no longer controls your decisions, and their absence no longer creates anxiety, something important has changed. You are no longer participating in the old emotional system. You are reclaiming your attention, your energy, and your ability to decide where your life goes next. Closure can also become complicated after a relationship with a narcissistic person. Many people naturally want an explanation, an apology, or some final conversation that makes everything suddenly make sense. But narcissistic dynamics often do not provide that kind of satisfying ending. A person who depends heavily on maintaining control may resist a truly final conversation, because finality means accepting that they no longer determine the direction of the relationship. Instead of giving closure, they may leave questions unanswered, rewrite events, shift blame, disappear, return unexpectedly, or create new confusion. This can keep the former partner mentally engaged long after the relationship has ended. Eventually, healing requires recognizing that closure does not always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes closure begins when you stop waiting for them to explain themselves and decide that your own understanding is enough. One of the most powerful shifts happens when you stop monitoring their behavior entirely. During the relationship, you may have spent enormous amounts of mental energy wondering where they were, what they were thinking, why they changed, or whether they were telling the truth. After separation, that habit can continue through social media. You may repeatedly check their posts, look for clues in their stories, notice who they follow, or analyze every photograph for hidden meaning. But every time you check, you keep the psychological connection alive. The real turning point comes when you no longer feel compelled to know what they are doing. Their whereabouts become irrelevant. Their new relationships become irrelevant. Their opinions become irrelevant. That emotional distance is not cruelty. It is evidence that your attention is finally returning to the person who needs it most: you. Narcissistic individuals may also become curious about whether they still have an emotional effect on you after separation. They may look for signs that you are struggling, especially through social media. A sad post, an emotional quote, a dramatic update, or anything suggesting that you are still consumed by the breakup can reassure them that they remain psychologically significant. That is one reason stepping away from social media for a while can sometimes be useful after a difficult separation. You do not need to perform your healing publicly, and you certainly do not need to prove that you are happy just to make someone else uncomfortable. Real healing is quieter than that. It happens when your happiness no longer depends on whether they see it, notice it, envy it, or react to it. Sometimes, when direct access disappears, a narcissistic person may attempt indirect ways of remaining connected. This can include unfamiliar accounts, questionable friend requests, mutual acquaintances, unexpected messages, or other attempts to discover what you are doing. Not every unfamiliar account or request necessarily has a hidden motive, so it is important not to assume that every online interaction is connected to an ex-partner. But if you recognize a repeated pattern of boundary testing, you do not have to participate. You can protect your privacy, adjust your settings, block unwanted contact, and refuse to engage. The objective is not to punish anyone. The objective is to make your boundaries clear and preserve your peace. Once you stop feeling obligated to respond to every attempt at gaining your attention, the old dynamic begins losing its power over you. Who ended the relationship may matter emotionally to you, but it does not determine who ultimately moves forward. A narcissist may initially experience a breakup as a victory if they believe they were the one who made the decision. They may feel powerful because they believe they controlled the timing and circumstances. But that sense of control can change when they discover that you are no longer available for manipulation. If they can no longer reach you, monitor you, provoke you, or receive emotional reactions from you, the meaning of the breakup changes. Meanwhile, if they see that you are rebuilding your life, reconnecting with yourself, becoming peaceful, and moving forward without needing their approval, they may realize that the relationship no longer gives them the influence they once had. Your progress becomes proof that their control was never permanent. The deepest healing begins when you stop making your recovery about what the narcissist will think. It can be tempting to imagine their reaction when they see you thriving, becoming more confident, meeting new people, or simply looking happier than before. But even that mindset can keep you emotionally connected to them. The real goal is not to become successful so they regret losing you. The real goal is to become so emotionally grounded that their regret no longer matters. Your life should not become a performance designed for someone else's reaction. It should become yours again. Establishing firm boundaries, limiting unnecessary contact, protecting your privacy, and refusing to participate in emotional games can help create the distance necessary for genuine recovery. You are not trying to defeat them. You are trying to recover yourself. This becomes even more important when completely disappearing is impossible. Family relationships, shared responsibilities, workplaces, or co-parenting arrangements can require some level of communication. In those situations, emotional detachment becomes more practical than dramatic disappearance. One commonly discussed strategy is called gray rocking, which involves keeping interactions brief, neutral, and focused on necessary information rather than emotional engagement. Instead of defending yourself against every accusation or explaining every decision, you respond only to what genuinely requires a response. You do not provide unnecessary emotional material for another person to manipulate. The purpose is not to be deliberately rude or hostile. It is to stop feeding an unhealthy interaction pattern with endless explanations, arguments, emotional reactions, and personal information. When you consistently refuse to be pulled into provocations, something changes inside you as well. At first, staying calm may require significant effort because your nervous system has become accustomed to reacting to unpredictability. You may feel an urge to defend yourself, correct false accusations, explain your intentions, or make the other person understand your perspective. But eventually, you begin realizing that you do not need to win every argument. You do not need to convince someone committed to misunderstanding you. You do not need to respond to every attempt to create emotional chaos. Your silence becomes less about making the other person suffer and more about protecting your own peace. That distinction matters. The strongest form of detachment is not an elaborate strategy designed to control someone else. It is the decision to stop allowing someone else's behavior to control you. As you move forward, remember that the ultimate victory is not watching a narcissist struggle after losing access to you. The real victory is reaching a place where their struggle is no longer your concern. You no longer measure your worth by whether they miss you, regret their actions, attempt to return, or react to your absence. You stop waiting for evidence that they finally understand what they lost. Instead, you become focused on rebuilding your confidence, strengthening your boundaries, and creating a life that feels peaceful without their presence. That is where your power truly returns. The moment you stop needing a reaction from them is the moment their reaction loses its importance. And when you reach that point, the relationship may finally be over, not only in your circumstances, but also in your mind. Creating deliberate emotional distance can completely change the dynamic with a narcissistic person. because it removes the reactions they may have relied upon to maintain influence. When you stop explaining yourself, defending every decision, or responding emotionally to their provocations, their usual methods of gaining attention become much less effective. Yet there is an interesting contradiction that can appear when they turn their attention toward someone new. At first, their new source of admiration may seem to satisfy their need for validation, making it appear as though they have completely moved on. But when they realize that your emotional availability has disappeared, curiosity can return. They may reach out, indirectly test your boundaries, or attempt to trigger the same reactions they once received from you. This can create a repetitive pattern where they approach, withdraw, and approach again, making the dynamic confusing and unpredictable. Understanding this cycle can help you stop interpreting every attempted reconnection as proof of genuine change. A narcissistic person returning does not automatically mean they have developed greater emotional maturity, accepted responsibility, or suddenly discovered the value of a healthy relationship. Sometimes the renewed interest is simply connected to the loss of access and the desire to determine whether they still have influence. That is why emotional detachment matters more than trying to predict their next move. When you become less focused on their behavior and more focused on your own stability, their actions gradually lose their ability to disturb your peace. This understanding can become an important part of personal growth because it teaches you to recognize patterns instead of reacting to individual moments. You begin looking at the entire dynamic rather than allowing one message, one apology, or one sudden change in attention to determine your emotional state. There is also value in drawing wisdom from spiritual teachings when navigating relationships that have caused emotional confusion. Biblical principles surrounding humility, accountability, self-sacrifice, forgiveness, and personal responsibility can offer useful perspectives, especially when they are applied with healthy boundaries. Compassion does not require tolerating mistreatment. Forgiveness does not mean allowing someone unlimited access to you. Humility does not mean accepting blame for behavior that was never yours. And self-sacrifice should never become an excuse for abandoning your own dignity or emotional well-being. These distinctions are important because people who have spent a long time around manipulative behavior can sometimes confuse being loving with constantly accommodating another person's harmful actions. Genuine growth involves learning how to remain compassionate while still recognizing when distance, boundaries, and self-protection are necessary. One of the strongest messages you can communicate through your behavior is that your emotional world is no longer available for manipulation. This does not mean pretending to be completely emotionless or deliberately acting cold to provoke a reaction. It means becoming grounded enough that you no longer feel compelled to respond to every attempt at getting your attention. When someone realizes that their words no longer create the same emotional reaction, their ability to influence the interaction can change dramatically. They may become more persistent because they are trying to recover the response they once received, or they may eventually lose interest when the interaction no longer provides the emotional reward they expected. Either way, your responsibility remains the same. Protect your peace, rather than becoming obsessed with understanding their reaction. Your calm is valuable because it belongs to you, not because it is useful as a weapon against someone else. This is especially important because some narcissistic relationship dynamics can revolve heavily around control. The person may attempt to determine when conversations happen, when affection is available, when conflict begins, or when communication suddenly disappears. If you constantly react according to their emotional rhythm, they remain capable of influencing your state from a distance. But when you establish your own rhythm, the dynamic begins to weaken. You decide when communication is necessary, what information you will share, which conversations deserve your attention, and when you will walk away from an interaction that has become unhealthy. That shift can feel uncomfortable at first because you may be accustomed to explaining yourself or seeking their approval. Over time, however, you begin discovering that you can make decisions without waiting for their emotional permission. That is a powerful step toward independence and emotional stability. After being discarded, blocked, ignored, or abruptly pushed away, it is completely understandable to experience confusion and emotional pain. You may wonder whether you should contact them, whether they will return, whether they miss you, or whether their new attention towards someone else means that you were somehow less valuable. Those questions can keep you trapped in the relationship mentally, even when there is no communication. A no-contact approach can create physical distance, but emotional recovery requires something deeper. You have to gradually stop making their behavior the center of your attention. Every day that you spend analyzing what they might be thinking is another day in which their presence occupies space in your mind. Healing begins when that space starts becoming available for your own goals, relationships, interests, and future. Your composure after a breakup is not about proving that you are stronger than the narcissist. It is about proving to yourself that you can survive the emotional disruption and still build a meaningful life. You do not have to appear perfect, completely unaffected, or instantly healed. Recovery is rarely that simple. There may be days when memories return, anger resurfaces, or you suddenly miss the person despite everything that happened. Those moments do not mean you have failed. They simply mean you are human, and healing is not always linear. What matters is that you continue choosing yourself instead of returning to patterns that repeatedly damaged your peace. Resilience develops through these small decisions, especially when nobody else sees them. Each time you protect a boundary, resist an unnecessary reaction, or redirect your attention toward your own life, you strengthen your independence. Eventually, the most meaningful change is not what happens to the narcissistic person, but what happens within you. You begin recognizing manipulation more quickly. You become more careful about who receives access to your time and emotional energy. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy and attention with genuine love. You become more comfortable saying no without feeling guilty, and more willing to leave situations that repeatedly undermine your self-respect. The experience may have caused pain, but it can also teach you lessons about boundaries, self-worth, and emotional awareness that remain valuable long after the relationship ends. You no longer need to wait for someone else to acknowledge your value. You begin acknowledging it yourself. That is a much more lasting form of healing than any reaction you could ever receive from the person who hurt you. If this message reflects something you have experienced, remember that you are not required to remain emotionally connected to someone simply because they once had a significant place in your life. You are allowed to step back, protect your peace, and choose relationships that are built on mutual respect rather than confusion and control. Share these insights with someone who may be struggling to understand a similar experience, because sometimes hearing the right perspective at the right moment can help another person recognize that they are not alone. And if you found this content helpful, consider supporting Narcissist Mind by liking the video and subscribing for more insights into narcissistic behavior, emotional boundaries, healing, and relationship psychology. Most importantly, give yourself patience during your recovery. You do not have to rebuild everything overnight. One healthy decision at a time, you can regain your confidence, reclaim your attention, and create a future that is no longer shaped by someone else's behavior.